Samurai games are just something the gaming industry can't let go of. A genre that's really almost as old as gaming itself has had a big samurai game tied to every single era. But there were one franchise within the 2000s, created by Capcom, that felt the most unique from your typical samurai experience. A series of games so unique and innovative that it might have been the strangest franchise within Capcom. This would of course be Onimusha. Onimusha would be a much more obscure franchise within the gigantic catalog of Capcom. Yet, it's one of the most interesting series of games that you probably have never played before. This is a series of games that lived and died on the PlayStation 2 with low sales and confusing sequels, that still somehow managed to retain passion and creativity with every single entry. Capcom fought extremely hard for financial success within this series, but it just wasn't something that everyone really clicked with. Following the explosive success of Resident Evil at the time, Capcom, known for its genre-defining fighting and survival horror games, would want to expand their formula into a fresh series that would take place in Sengoku, Japan, following a samurai exploring a feudal Japanese castle in the midst of a demon uprising, blending real Japanese history with big fantasy elements. This project would of course lead into the development of the first Onimusha game for the PS1, but the development would lead it into the PS2, where it would become a highly anticipated launch title for the console, going by Onimusha Warlords. It was the first game to really show off the PS2's strengths and really have its cutscenes act as a movie. Within the first week of Japan, the game had already sold over 800,000 copies, and after a month, the number was well over 1 million. But within the West, the number was respectable, just nowhere near its Japanese fanbase. And this would honestly have to be the start of Capcom's problem. While this entry and its sequel would be fairly successful in Japan, Capcom's dream to make Onimusha a worldwide success was extremely strong. And what would ensue is more so an aesthetical detachment mixed heavily with misunderstanding on what made the product so enjoyable in the first place, leading to a series that seems to have been battling itself on its identity, trying not to become forgotten and faced with obscurity with every single entry. And all of this would lead into the new Onimusha game that has the most potential to make this almost forgotten franchise remembered. Onimusha Warlords would be one of the first big games launched for the PS2, and with that, it was one of the most stunning games for the console in the early 2000s, and just honestly one of the most stunning games of all time, showcasing a lot of new graphical improvements over the PS1, like how faces are actually faces and not pixels or triangles. This already was a crazy selling point for Onimusha worldwide, as this level of graphical fidelity and movie-like cutscenes were unlike anything before. The game would open up with the Battle of Okehazama in 1582, where a man named Nobunaga Oda would be trying to gain dominance over Japan. It would then cut back to our protagonist Samanosuke Akechi, as he would watch the battle from above. Samanosuke is an interesting protagonist that isn't exactly a self-insert, but is more or less a blanket character. There aren't much reflections of his personality, and he's mainly a vessel for the plot to push forward. He's your stoic samurai with determination, looking to help those in need, and he gets the job done, and his design is overall pretty solid. But the personalities and performances of the other protagonists are a lot more interesting and notable in the sequels in my opinion. Nobunaga Oda would be the antagonist of the plot, where in the middle of the Battle of Okehazama, he is shot in the throat and dies, only to be resurrected as a demon by the demonic Genma army. Honestly not sure why Nobunaga was involved in so many feudal Japan games around this time, but whatever. The characters of Onimusha aren't anything to write home about, and they get the job done and they aren't insufferable, unless you have it on the English dub. This was definitely around the time where the English dub in Japanese games were extremely hit or miss for having a dub that will either have the funniest dialogue you will ever hear,
Anji-ichi, yes, that's it. And so, what's your name?
or it was so bad to where it's just not even funny. And Capcom just seemed to be on a roll, with DMC1 also having an equally funny dub performance at times. Thankfully they got it together when they were releasing Resident Evil 4. Samanosuke at the end of the prologue would be blessed by the so-called Oni clan, giving him powers to fight back the demonic Genma forces. The Genma are the clan that brought back Nobunaga from the dead, and as a historical yet fantasy offshoot of the actual Nobunaga and feudal era of Japan, this genuinely brings one of the most unique vibes of any game that I've ever played. The setting and era of this game brings a lot of interesting imagery to the feudal era of Japan, while also using Inabayama Castle, which is the place that most of this game takes place in. It's modeled after the real castle and Sengoku era fortress, with its stone walls, wooden gates, and its authentic courtyards. The village, shrines, and forest are all grounded in historical realism, which just makes its supernatural elements stand out so much more. Most samurai games at the time either went full-on realism like Bushido Blade, or pure fantasy like Samurai Showdown. The lighting and atmosphere is hauntingly beautiful, and a lot of scenes would have dimly dimly lit torchlights, flickering candles, and small corridors that just make you feel claustrophobic, especially with the increased enemy count later on. For a PS2 game though, Capcom didn't want to hop on the 3D hype train just yet, and would use pre-rendered backgrounds, which are some of my favorite aspects of older games. If you don't know what that is, it's basically when a game uses static 2D images for its backgrounds instead of rendering the environment in real time. Games like Resident Evil and Final Fantasy loved using pre-rendered backgrounds, but because of the hardware limitations, they look nowhere near as crisp as this. The backgrounds definitely shine more throughout its PS2 copy than its remaster in my opinion, so some of the footage might be going back and forth between both copies. Paired with the graphical boost was the camera angles that the game used. While this game definitely had the power to use a fully 3D camera, Capcom stayed with its camera angles like Resident Evil and Dino Crisis. But what separates Onimusha from these games is the fact that this game is not a survival horror game. This game is creepy and has an ominous tone through and through, but it's not really meant to scare you. It's kinda like how Resident Evil 4 is scary themed, but not that scary of a horror game. Capcom, with its camera angles, is usually using this against you, not letting you have full control to see what's ahead of you, and in some games even using it to set up a jump scare. Onimusha is a little spooky, but its camera angles aren't really set up to be against you for the most part. It's actually meant to highlight the amazing art and pre-rendered backgrounds that the developers worked so hard on. There's a lot of amazing scenes of this game, and it really shows with every single angle. The colors are vibrant, the environments are detailed, and the blend of that beautiful 2D artwork tied to the 3D characters work extremely well. This style of Onimusha highlighted just how diverse Capcom can be within its games. The combat of this game would also show this, due to its dated setting where Capcom couldn't use guns, which I think they liked a little too much at this time. As hard as the difficulty of Onimusha can get, the game promotes a very aggressive playstyle, as one of the main ways to heal within this game would be through the yellow souls that come out of killing your enemies. There are herbs and other items for healing, but they just don't show up as much as you think they would, usually leading to you fighting every enemy in the room until you can finally get some yellow souls. This would also be another opposite within the Resident Evil game loop, as the more you are able to get away without fighting zombies in those games, the better, as ammo is scarce and managing your resources are key. Around when Onimusha was released, the constant comparisons to Resident Evil were almost never ending, coming from all types of angles of game journalists and fans, though it wasn't too much of a detriment as it was able to draw a lot of attention to Onimusha as a new IP. But besides the small head start that Onimusha had at the start of the generation, it wasn't something sustainable that was going to leave an impact. The plot overall played it extremely safe, and it's not the most riveting part of the game. The most notable thing about Samanosuke is the fact that he's voiced by Takeshi Kaneshiro, which is a renowned Japanese actor. The game also uses full body motion capture, which is great for its time, and it also had one of the most realistic looking cutscenes. But within that same year, we got Metal Gear Solid 2, which also uses motion capture to its compelling narrative. And after that, motion capture became the norm, being used in almost every single game of the PS2 for better in-game cutscenes. Onimusha was a pretty solid banger to start off the generation, but it just wasn't the most gripping game that defined Capcom or the PS2. This game is easily beatable within like 4 hours, and within that same year we got Final Fantasy X, Silent Hill 2, the first Devil May Cry, and so much more. Not to mention just how stacked 2002 and 2003 got with games as well. It's a pretty solid experience, but it was just so quickly outmatched by its competition, especially with how strong PS2 developers came out for this console, and with how generationally defining a lot of the games were around this time period. Onimusha would be very easily phased out and forgotten, even within its Japanese audience, which would have resonated with this game the most. Capcom definitely knew that they'd have to act fast if they wanted to save the series and keep the ball rolling, while the Onimusha name still had some buzz around it. Thankfully, it seemed that they understood this very well, dropping a sequel to this game only about a year and some change later. But with such little time to create and develop a sequel for this game, it would end up being one of the strangest sequels that I've ever played. Alright, so I first want to mention that I don't dislike this game. This isn't a Devil May Cry 1 to Devil May Cry 2 situation, thankfully. And to be honest, Onimusha 2 is actually extremely enjoyable and it's my second favorite in the series. But this game could not be a weirder follow-up to Onimusha Warlords that started the whole series. One reason for why this game would be so different is probably the fact that Onimusha 2 was in development at the same time as Onimusha 1. Capcom got cocky. They knew that Onimusha would sell well, so they already kickstarted the second game to have it released soon after to capture the the hype cycle. The only thing is that this game was developed by an entirely different studio. Onimusha 2 would seem more like a reboot of the series in my opinion, retuning a lot of what made the original Onimusha special. It would seemingly drop a lot of the historical fantasy elements from its presentation, having a more adventure game feel to it, and also having multiple party member storylines which can lead into different endings with dating sim mechanics. Yeah, for some reason there's dating sim mechanics in this game, and there's even an article mentioning this, calling Onimusha the new dating sim game, which is genuinely hilarious. Onimusha 2 would be using a new protagonist called Jubei Yagyu, who is modeled after the famous Japanese actor named Yuzuku Matsuda, who passed away in 1989. Now this is crucial to Onimusha 2's hype cycle, and is actually a much more dramatic change than just a new face for the main character. See, Yuzuku Matsuda has been a massive celebrity for Japanese media. Not only is he a popular actor, but he's also the grandfather of the nonchalant archetype. You know, before the memes. In a lot of his acting roles of film, he plays the cool, dangerous, and unpredictable outsider who always stood against the system, often with an air of rebellion or mystery. No matter what film he was in, he usually always played the stylish rebel. To compare his status here, it would be something along the lines of Keanu Reeves, but for Japanese people. And most of your favorite works probably reference him too. Spike Spiegel, who is the protagonist of Cowboy Bebop, was directly inspired by Yuzuku. Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star, who has inspired countless of other works, was originally based off of Yuzuku, and Aokiji in One Piece is also inspired by Yuzuku, and a lot more characters as well. So when the launch trailers for Onimusha 2 were releasing in Japan, people were ecstatic to see Yuzuku Matsuda being represented in one of the coolest ways, a Sengoku samurai in the upcoming Onimusha. The only problem with this is that nobody in the West knew who this guy was. So when it came to the trailers and marketing, people in the West didn't have that same excitement to them, as it was just a new face for a protagonist. It also did feel like the marketing for Onimusha wasn't that great outside of Japan, but Onimusha has always been more catered towards a Japanese audience anyway, which makes sense given the context of these games. The sales for Onimusha 2 were also decently similar to the first game, with a very big Japanese audience that is very eager about its cultural background of Japan, and mediocre sales within the Western fanbase, as a big interest that they had really only went into how the game plays, its graphics, and yada yada. The game would open up with a recap of the first game, showing that it's not fully rebooting or reimagining the series. It would then cut into the destruction of a village called Yagyu Village. This would also happen to be the village of our protagonist Jubei Yagyu. It would also showcase many other characters whose stories can be woven into the main plot depending on how you interact with them, but more on that later. From the opening of the game, there's a lot that feels the same. It opens up with Jubei returning to his village, finding everyone to be slaughtered. It brings an extremely beautiful scene with the iconic pre-rendered backgrounds that I love so much. The combat and movement still feel similar, and we're still on fixed camera angles, and we're even still fighting the various demons called Genma. Everything feels like Onimusha, until you reach the first real area of this game, Imasho Village. This is where things within this game really start to take its own route. The tone, design, and overall presentation feels massively different, with the plot of the game centering around Jubei and his quest for the 5 orbs, while also wanting revenge for the people who slaughtered his family and village. Each orb that Jubei would get would be its own little arc within the plot, and every time Jubei would obtain an orb, he would return to Imasho Village soon after. This village would work as a small hub for buying things from merchants, to talking to NPCs, and even doing small side quests. Nearby the village would be a gold mine that would attract a lot of people to this area, and when killing Genma, you can also pick up gold to spend within this village. Only a lot of things that you can buy would be gifts for the other characters. The tone of this game is a whole lot happier, lighter, and less dreadful than the first Onimusha. It would also have more daylight and brighter scenes. It would also have more open combat areas rather than the tight claustrophobic environments of the first game's castle. The horror elements of Onimusha are also replaced with more action and adventurous themes, further breaking away from the comparisons of Resident Evil. The reception of this was honestly 50-50, as a lot of people liked the new direction and enjoyed the more action game approach, and others would happen to enjoy the more dark and horror approach of the first game. I personally like the atmosphere more in the first game, but I did find myself enjoying the combat and game loop of this game more. Though the biggest change within this sequel would have to be the cast of characters and the gift system. See, Onimusha 1 had a small cast of characters with really only 2 consistent characters, being Samanosuke and Kaede. Onimusha 2 would have the protagonist Jubei, a girl named Oyu, Magoichi, Eke, and Kotaro. When talking to them in Imasho Village, you can get to know them by their personality, and when buying things within the village, you can actually offer them to the characters to make them happy. The point of this is that they actually give you resources back in return. You can't buy armor or healing items, so the more expensive gift catered towards the character's taste, the better the item that they will give you in return. There is an invisible friendship bar with each of the characters, and the higher the bar for the characters, then the more they'll like you, which can lead to them helping you within boss fights, but more importantly, it can dramatically change the story. Some characters may be present within the final battle of the game. Poor relationships can lead to the characters dying earlier or just just not showing up at all for certain important moments, and the ending can even change depending on who you are closest to. Now, the actual ending of this game stays intact, but you also could miss out on possible scenes or allied betrayals at the end of the game, and all of that is dependent on what and how many gifts you give them throughout the game. And if you give them gifts that they don't like, then they'll just start hating you. This whole system is pretty hit or miss in my opinion. I don't hate it, but I can't say I'm the biggest fan, as I think I enjoyed the fixed narrative of the first game. Most people would just simp for the only female character named OU and just get the best ending with her, especially as her story is mostly intertwined with the main story, as she is Jubei's canon love interest. The whole system and having multiple characters that can affect the story was very interesting, as having constant companions with you and being able to speak to NPCs so consistently felt so different than the dreadful and scary atmosphere of the first game. I think Capcom really wanted to separate the series from survival horror with this installment. The term Resident Evil clone was just so deeply tied with Onimusha and how people viewed this series that they probably wanted to make Onimusha 2 seem like a completely different game aesthetically, in order to garner its own identity. To which they would have succeeded, but arguably Onimusha 2's aesthetics and overall look can be seen as a downgrade compared to the first game. Tied with the new look was the gift system and multiple character storylines that was introduced, which just didn't hit the mark as strong as it could have. Most players didn't understand the gift system and how it worked, which led to a lot of confusion on how to get the full picture of every storyline. The whole system honestly wasn't even necessary to begin with, and while it might have added replay value, everything could have very easily been added into the main plot, and the confusion could have just been avoided. The story itself isn't all too bad, focusing on Jubei's revenge and forming a love story with OU, but it fell into the same issue as the first Onimusha. It wasn't the revolutionary title that Capcom wanted for a big hit. Capcom's dream of making the Onimusha name mainstream would never come to fruition by slapping a famous Japanese actor as the protagonist and adding multiple storyline routes. They needed something a lot bigger and more revolutionary. And while this game did sell well, it would face the same potential obscurity as the first game, as it just wasn't the most memorable option when compared to its insane competition. The gameplay of the Onimusha games would be its most memorable aspect, but even that wouldn't be enough to keep it in the eyes of many. And Capcom would once again have to act fast if they wanted to make a difference with the struggling franchise. And of course, like I mentioned with the original Onimusha, the voice acting is definitely not its strong suit. It's always kind of been a mixed bag with the original and now within its sequel. And while some people are just fine with the voice acting of these games, the usual response to the English voice acting was pretty abysmal.
That does it! Outside now!
Thankfully, with Onimusha 1 we were able to switch the voice acting to the Japanese cast, which bolstered a lot more emotion and character within the scenes. Unfortunately, with Onimusha 2 releasing in the West, not only were the sales significantly worse than the sales in Japan, but unlike the first game, you couldn't swap the voice acting to Japanese, where it sounded a lot better and more fitting for the story. You kinda just had to sit there and listen to these characters having the most awkward and interesting performances ever. The ending of this game was also not as satisfying, as the second half of the game becomes extremely focused on the level-to-level design following Jubei's story. After a certain point in the story, Jubei just doesn't go back to Imasha village, and you're just completely unable to access it as well. Through all of the weird decisions and awkward directions that they took, this game was once again a financial success in Japan and sold well over 1 million copies at a pace close to the first Onimusha, which is honestly impressive that Capcom was able to captivate on the hype so well. It might sound like I'm being overly negative towards this game, but it is still a very enjoyable entry within the series that I genuinely enjoyed. It's just an overall weird sequel to the first Onimusha that seems to attempt to slightly reboot the brand in a new light. The following games that ensued after Onimusha 2 would be Onimusha Tactics for the Game Boy Advance and Onimusha Blade Warriors, which released the following year in 2003. I haven't played either of these games, nor do I plan to play them to be honest. Tactics would be Onimusha's shot at an Onimusha RPG, but the console of choice really didn't make much sense, and it kind of just amounted as a failed attempt to join the GBA market. The Pokemon machine didn't really take this very well, and Onimusha Tactics would completely fade from existence. Blade Warriors was a PS2 spin-off that had a playstyle of something Capcom is a bit more familiar with, a fighting game. But it's not just any fighting game, it would play more specifically like a Smash title. Now honestly, something about the Onimusha series playing like this just really doesn't sit right with me. And I think that this would have worked so much better as a traditional 2D fighter, especially when Capcom has so much more experience with something like Street Fighter. Blade Warriors was a little clunky and seemed like one of those games that you would hop on with your boys, play for an hour hour and then get off and probably never try again. There was a story mode, but that was also pretty bare bones. Overall, these two games aren't really seen as a crucial point within the series, and I don't think I'm the only one who skipped out on them. Plus, I think they just needed something to fill in the gap while Capcom developed their most expensive title within the franchise yet, which would also have one of the biggest teams of Capcom's developing the game ever. This game would be released within the following year when they released the third entry into the Onimusha title, Onimusha 3 Demon Siege. So to give some context, Capcom around the release of Onimusha 3 was not in the best financial spot. They were struggling heavily with their releases, and having so many projects and titles being created without enough time in the oven, Capcom was losing a lot of money year by year. Mega Man was almost completely irrelevant, especially within the 3D variations. Resident Evil still hasn't had a big mainline release since the third game in 1999. Dino Crisis 3 was pretty mediocre, and Street Fighter wasn't too hot anymore because the arcades were losing popularity. Devil May Cry 2 also existed. There was a lot riding on Onimusha 3 for multiple reasons. The budget of this game would be absolutely massive, having one of the biggest development teams of Capcom, and if successful, this game would fully establish Onimusha as one of the strongest IPs within Capcom. It would also simultaneously save Capcom from this downward financial spiral. In an attempt to make Onimusha a more broadly appealing game outside of Japan, they would also add a main character called Jacques Blanc from the French army. It introduced time travel mechanics to the main plot, and it's just as insane as it sounds. The game would take place both in Sengoku, Japan, with the return of Samanosuke from the first Onimusha. Simultaneously, it would also take place in 2004 modern-day Paris, where the Genma, after extensive research on time travel, would open a portal to the future in order to not only take over Japan during the Sengoku era, but also take over the world in the future. The producer of Onimusha, being Keiji Inafune, wanted Onimusha 3 to be on par with a big-budget Hollywood blockbuster, so the game was made on an entirely new engine that allowed them to go fully 3D within its visuals. The first cutscene of this would be a spectacle on its own, as it's one of the best first cutscenes I've ever seen, and can really only imagine just how jaw-dropping this was back in 2004. It was a whole 7 minutes long and stands as one of the longest pre-rendered cutscenes of the entire PS2 era. But while everything sounds great and innovative for this title, it wasn't exactly the financial success that Capcom was hoping for. It actually sold less than both Onimusha 1 and 2 surprisingly, and after all that work for a more Western audience, most of the sales were, once again, from Japan, which actually surprises me. But even though Onimusha 3 wasn't the financial success that Capcom wanted, it was pretty well received by both critics and players. Personally, this game was pretty cool in my opinion, but I'm genuinely baffled at why Capcom thought fusing ancient Japan with modern day France was a good idea. Like, this game is still good for what it is, but that's just two vastly different settings and groups of people to advertise a game to. I mean, take a look at Samanosuke traveling modern day Paris. This literally does not look real. This is a fever dream. I think that the idea and the heart was there, I just don't think Capcom knew its audience as well as they could have. I also think that Jacques as a character is just not the most appealing design for something like Onimusha. I feel like it's not crazy to say that this guy, compared to Samanosuke, is extremely jarring to look at. We have the young and very handsome Japanese samurai with long luscious hair versus the old balding French guy as the protagonist. Within Onimusha 3, Jacques definitely carries that protagonist energy just as much as Samanosuke. It's just that his design doesn't carry that same weight, and it feels really weird and jarring seeing him on some of the promotional art, as he just genuinely does not look like he's supposed to be there. With Onimusha 2 being one of the strangest sequels that I've ever played, Onimusha 3 would one-up it and be an even stranger sequel than that. But there are a lot of positives with this game. Due to the drastic difference in setting between modern-day Paris and Sengoku, Japan, the game would have one of the most unique premises of all time. It's extremely original and would have an even more original game loop. With the antagonist of Onimusha 1 being Nobunaga, he's still roaming around trying to take over Japan as Samanosuke would infiltrate Honnoji Temple. On the other hand, modern-day Paris would be completely raided by Genma, and Jacques Blanc would be the only French soldier able to hold his ground against the demons. Nobunaga then teleports Samanosuke to Paris in 2004, and the teleportation would also affect Jacques by bringing him back to Sengoku, Japan. What would ensue is essentially a game loop that involves both characters exploring areas drastically different from each other and eventually syncing up in the same areas but being 500 years apart. The areas that Jacques would explore would be the older and more traditional setting of Japan, with some areas looking extremely full with life, while Samanosuke showcased the monuments of modern-day France, and some of the same areas would be withered away with time. They also go back to using the iconic Resident Evil design of unlocking certain areas by gaining a certain artifact or key in order to open the door or blockage, which would promote backtracking and memorization. Only this time it's completely new, as some items used to unlock progression areas are completely unattainable, as you would have to switch back from character to character to gain items and then switch back to unlock doors of progression and then switch back later, continuing the game loop. It was extremely interesting, especially as the environments were so drastically different from each other. They would also play very differently, with Samanosuke being your typical samurai with moves similar to the first Onimusha, and the Jack segments would also be pretty fun, with his style of combat feeling a bit more open and varied. Having whips and staffs that can do multi-hit attacks, the game would also ditch the fixed camera in return for something that's a bit closer to a free roam, but doesn't exactly give you the full control. It was a more dynamic camera that follows you and can even sometimes zoom in and out depending on what you're fighting. It definitely shines more in the one-on-one fights and looks so much cooler than the previous entries in my opinion. I also feel that this was the Onimusha game to truly break out of the Resident Evil comparisons. It was just so drastically different than not only any Resident Evil game, but also any game that Capcom has made, both from a gameplay standpoint and narratively. Onimusha really felt like its own thing for once. There was even a part where we play as Jack's girlfriend, who was this awesome gun-wielding powerhouse that felt like Lara Croft on steroids. The new engine felt fitting for the blockbuster-like narrative, rendering everything in 3D, and with the free roam camera, it felt like they were properly assimilating to other 3D games at the time. But there was still a major problem. Onimusha 3, through all of its innovations, still didn't make Onimusha feel like the grand IP that Capcom wanted for the company. With everything included in this story, the plot felt really unique but way too busy. The revamped combat and graphics made the game look slightly cooler than previous entries, but it also now felt generic and way too simple and easy, especially with how it seemed like Onimusha 3 was aiming to be more of an action game than Onimusha 1 and 2. Yet, if we had to compare Onimusha 3 to just about any action game around this era, it's most likely getting floored in every single aspect. With Onimusha 1, we at least had the heavy Japanese aesthetics within the game, giving it a more defined personality and identity. There is a lot going on in Onimusha 3, and not everything flows together so smoothly. I personally feel like the game lacks any defining traits to really give it its own identity within the series. Just like Onimusha 2, I really don't hate this game. I disliked it a little more than the previous entries due to some of the changes like 3D and the forced French aspects for Western appeal, but most importantly, this game once again just did not stand out in the way that Capcom had hoped for. The failure was also arguably even worse for the company this time around, just because of just how hard they were banking on it. With the massive budget, massive development team, and the financial state of Capcom as a whole, Onimusha 3 had a lot of crazy innovations for it to be the grand finale of the series, but it really just doesn't come off as the ultimate finale for Onimusha. The wacky time travel plot that includes modern day France was cool, but didn't exactly feel like a plot too fitting for the series. And in some ways, this game really felt like a reboot, and I think the devs and general player base also felt this. And as for Capcom's downhill financial spiral, this game did not save them, of course. Their answer to this was another Resident Evil game that I'm sure you guys have heard many times before, plus one of, if not the greatest action game in existence, and also the birth of something extremely special. Onimusha, within all three games, somehow feels vastly different every time. All three of these games have very different atmospheres, mechanics, and pacing that almost feels like Capcom is trying to reinvent the franchise with every entry. The biggest problem that I had with Onimusha 3 was its Hollywood-esque feel, as this was never a series that needed high-action cutscenes or big giant explosions all the time. The game felt like it overall lost the foundation that it was building off from the first entry, all to appeal more to a Western audience that didn't even care when the game was out. And due to the crazy financial loss of the game, tied with Onimusha 3 ending the series supposedly, it seemed like Capcom's Onimusha craze had finally ended. But not all was lost. The Onimusha team split into different parts of Capcom after Onimusha 3, which is expected as they were onto bigger and better things now. A lot of Onimusha's aspects, despite not getting the recognition it deserved within its own games, would be placed into new games. The over-the-shoulder view of Resident Evil 4 was inspired from Onimusha 3. Lee Byung-hun was in an Xbox game called Lost Planet developed by Capcom. This doesn't have anything to do with Onimusha, I just wanted to mention it. This guy named Hiroyuki Kobayashi, who really only worked on Resident Evil and Dino Crisis, was inspired by Onimusha and in Dynasty Warriors. So he created this new game called Sengoku Basara that also takes place in Sengoku, Japan. 2005 went on without any news of Onimusha until 2006, where it would be revealed that a new Onimusha was in the works. But this time the game would be called Shin Onimusha instead of Onimusha 4, Shin usually meaning something new. So in this context, this game would be somewhat of a reboot of the series, again. But after such a weird run of Onimusha, trying so hard to appeal to both a Japanese and Western audience, plus having the series essentially ended with a third game, what could a new Onimusha even be about, and why even make a fourth game? But with a vastly smaller team and very high development crunch, this game would be made by people who were very passionate about the series and really wanted the Onimusha name to succeed. This would also go on to be my favorite in the franchise. Onimusha 4, more accurately called Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, would be released in 2006, and would take place 15 years after Onimusha 3. This game was under a new Onimusha team and under a new director, and saw a lot of new aspects within the story, pacing, aesthetics, and also gameplay. One thing that makes this game extremely special and different from the last 3 Onimusha games is the fact that they wanted to view Onimusha under a new light. This game feels extremely unique in every single aspect, and had the direction of the game align more closely with something like a shonen anime. Dawn of Dreams still takes history and the supernatural into consideration, but also has a lot more anime and fantasy influences within its story, gameplay, and overall cast. This is immediately shown within the first cutscene, where 2 figures are battling on a roof with an insane backdrop. It then cuts to our main protagonist Soki cutting straight through some Genma Titan in the most anime fashion I've ever seen. There's a very big emphasis on looking cool within this game. This aspect was always kind of present within Onimusha, but it was always very grounded and realistic, with Samanosuke and Jubei just being very grounded swordsmen who are very knowledgeable and skilled within sword combat. This is an aspect completely blown out of proportion in Dawn of Dreams. This game barely views our protagonist or his friends as samurai, but more so as heroes who are not only going to fight for their own cause, but also to protect the world. I absolutely love the premise that this game has. Unfortunately, there's little that's actually documented on the making of Dawn of Dreams, probably because of the smaller development team. It's nowhere near perfect, but from everything that's here, it's very fun, creative, and it brims with passion. It introduces many new characters, starting from our protagonist Soki, who is also titled Oni of the Ash. It takes place 16 years after Onimusha 3 in 1598, and within real events, a man named Hideyoshi Toyotomi would unify and control all of Japan. This ended the bloodshedding civil war that filled the Sengoku era of Japan, and would see changes within the country like foreign trade, which would eventually lead into Christianity being spread within Japan as well. They also tried to expand their power by assaulting Korea, but that didn't really work out. But to stay in context for Onimusha, Nobunaga, who was the main antagonist of all of the games, has finally died. And now Hideyoshi would be the man to unify Japan, but also would be consumed by the demonic power of Nobunaga, and would also be the main antagonist. There would also be the appearance of something called the Omen Star, which would also bring back the appearance of Demon Genma. They would also be controlled by Hideyoshi. From an aesthetic standpoint, this game might be the most beautiful game within the franchise. The art direction here is extremely distinct, bringing back and embracing the Japanese visuals even more than the first Onimusha. The colors are vibrant, and the Omen Star in the later levels really brings a sense of imminent danger, with how it engulfs the land with its purple hue. It embraces the more fantasy and heroic vibes with its rich color and saturated tones. This is also of course shown within its cast of characters as well, leaving the historical designs for more personal and stylish designs. Soki would view the unification semi-negatively due to Hideyoshi's corrupted ruling, using Genma to obtain peace. Instead of the unification being something positive, it would more so be seen as a betrayal of honor and humanity. Throughout the journey, Soki would run into different kinds of people along the way, people who would have all sorts of different motivations but are aligned with the same goals, with everyone contributing something very unique to the team. This cast is one of the more solid groups of the Onimusha series, and this guy was so cool that he might be my favorite character of the entire franchise. He's a Portuguese Christian foreigner who has giant arms and only speaks with his fists. The entire cast would be pretty original with the exception of Akane Yagi, who would be the granddaughter of Jubei from the second game and is part of the main cast. Onimusha was never a series with a big cast or focused on its many characters, but Dawn of Dreams definitely changes that. There's a total of 6 main characters that have their own development and arcs that go deeper into their backgrounds. The initial meeting with each character usually being pretty hostile, and with Roberto, for example, who came to Japan to help others, would witness powerful and religious figures become corrupted and would even lose a family member to the Genma, pushing his mental state to a point of no return. And even after breaking him out, he refuses to speak to you, but understanding him as a person and mentally allows you to reach him in a way that was impossible before. Dawn of Dreams had character arcs so good I almost forgot I was even playing an Onimusha game. The unfortunate part is that this game would be created with a much lower budget than the other Onimusha games, which was kind of obvious given how the third entry bombed pretty badly, leading to these static cutscenes where certain plot points would be unraveled. But one thing that the budget didn't seem to affect too much was its gameplay. I haven't really commented on the gameplay portions within these games, but that's because they aren't all too different than one another. But Dawn of Dreams really sells that shonen anime feel in a way that makes this game addicting. This game basically takes the coolness of Onimusha and ramps it up to 11 in every aspect, including its gameplay. The lock-on and overall fighting felt so much more fluid and tighter mechanically, but it also took some inspiration from other action games around the time, especially with how big Devil May Cry were getting. I'm sure they wanted to revamp the gameplay just a little bit in order to match the fun action games that they were putting out. There's once again no fixed camera angle in this game, and it's on the 3D engine of the third game, and you can gain levels when fighting and collecting Genma souls. You can even upgrade your weapons and armor and gain new moves in combat, and most importantly, you can now combo. It really doesn't sound like much, but given that this is an Onimusha title, the fact that you can combo your enemies really shows the progression of the series better than any other aspect of the game. Alongside that, they would have the most flashy heavy-like attacks that you can do in this game that really flaunts its new style. These attacks would allow you to chain together slash attacks depending on the weapon that you're using, and depending on how powerful your sword is or how leveled you are, you can completely wipe out rooms with one heavy chain attack, and it's probably my favorite aspect of the gameplay. Alongside this, you aren't limited to just playing one character. This game kind of plays like a co-op game or something similar to Resident Evil 5, where you would play the game with an AI counterpart. They aren't in every level, and in some parts you are playing alone, and you can switch back and forth between Soki or your teammate in order to progress the game. All of the teammates would also have their own unique abilities and moves, and you can level them up the same way that you level Soki. It's pretty insane how well they play, and it's also co-op if you have another person to play with. If this game ever got remastered or ported to modern platforms, I think it would explode, as this would be one of the most fun games to play with a friend. The gameplay also shows the new direction and meaning of Onimusha that the team wanted to revamp. It's my favorite Onimusha game to play, followed by the second game in my opinion. Unfortunately, Capcom just has horrible understanding on what a good global release is, so they like to alter things for the Western audience when there really isn't a good reason to do so. As when they released Dawn of Dreams in the West, they bumped the difficulty heavily, thinking that the brutal difficulty would jive better for Western audiences. This was probably due to the bombshell that was Devil May Cry 2, and I think we all know that that game was just hold square to win and was mind-numbingly easy. This also shows within Devil May Cry 3 and how that game's difficulty was so unforgiving. They changed the normal difficulty of the game to match Japan's hard mode, and the Western release wouldn't even have an easy mode. More recently at the time with Onimusha 3, it also faced similar criticism as this game was just way too easy for the most part. It wasn't DMC2 levels of I'm going to fall asleep, but it was pretty easy. Capcom, instead of finding ways to properly balance the enemy AI and player progression, would rather just completely alter a version of the game that would be manufactured and sold. And this also happened with another Sengoku Japan game called Sengoku Pasara. This game rightfully bombed in the West because Capcom chose to remove any mention of Japan and opted to make the game about a biblical story. It almost makes me not even feel bad anymore at Capcom's inherent lack of understanding for what people wanted. But Dawn of Dreams is unfortunately plagued with health sponges, difficulty spikes, and certain stages that just made me want to drop the game entirely. The party AI is a massively fun addition, but it doesn't really add much to the gameplay if they get slammed so easily in combat, to where I have to waste all of my resources leveling them up just for them to get slammed 2 minutes later on the battlefield. The game is amazing, but you will get stuck at too many points within the story simply because of how difficult the game can get. This wasn't a problem in the Japanese release because everything was balanced properly and a lot more enjoyable over there, so the people who actually picked up the game probably completed it. This is especially egregious near the end of the game, where you fight 4 final bosses that go back to back. One save, by the way. For many reasons outside of me just liking this game, it desperately needs some sort of remaster or remake within the series. It's just too good to be dragged down by garbage like this. Onimusha as a whole has very weird correlations with each other. Dawn of Dreams would seemingly have the most in common with the second game, as it brings a lot of new aspects and ideas within the franchise, while also keeping things very original within the plot and characters, even having the character Akane, who is a direct granddaughter of the protagonist of the second game. The first entry seems to relate well with the third game, sharing similar mechanics and the same protagonist. To me, it just feels like the Onimusha brand was just not developed enough. None of these games feel undercooked, but it's almost like every single entry just has some sort of personality disorder. The first game wanted to have spooky vibes and be like Resident Evil with samurais. The second game wanted to be like an action game. Then the third game game went on to be this super expensive blockbuster film. Then the fourth game wanted to be like a shonen anime at the time. Unlike a lot of franchises within Capcom, or any game for that matter, Onimusha just didn't know what it wanted to be, unfortunately. I still love these games to death and had a ton of fun playing them for the first time, but I imagine that these games would have held up with a much bigger legacy if they started with something strong and then built upon it aesthetically alongside its story. The plots within these games correlate nicely, but every single entry was just striving for different aesthetics, which definitely doesn't help a plot connection within the entries, leading them all to different results. The only games in the franchise really achieving financial success would be Onimusha 1 and 2. This was especially embarrassing as the franchise lived and died on the most successful console at the time, the PlayStation 2. The competition became sink or swim as the PS2 birthed some of the most generationally impactful video games of all time. A lot of games from this generation are still played and held with extremely high respect today. People weren't going to just sit around and wait for Capcom to figure it out. The options felt almost endless, and just about any genre had one shining example of a good game, with many games behind that. And if we're talking about action games, we had the God of War duology, Devil May Cry 1 and 3, God Hand, Prince of Persia, Yakuza 1 and 2, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, Shinobi, and Way of Samurai 1 and 2. Nobody was just sitting around waiting for Onimusha to get it together, as the options just kept coming. And while the franchise wasn't able to solidify itself in the beginning with Onimusha 1 and 2, it was left behind by the consistent and fast innovations of every other game on the platform, which is why a lot of people weren't all that surprised when the Onimusha hype train was finally dead after Dawn of Dream. There were no more reports of a new Onimusha game in the works, and honestly, even Capcom wanted to move away from it at this point, only releasing 2 Onimusha mangas that are actually really good, and a Onimusha live action movie. Oh right, that never came out. But through all the hardships with Onimusha as a brand, it seems like Capcom's fire for Onimusha wasn't completely gone, as in 2019, Onimusha 1 would get a remaster, and in 2022, Onimusha would have a Netflix adaptation, and the only substantial update within Onimusha would be, of course, Onimusha Way of Sword, which is the brand new Onimusha game being released sometime within 2026. It's been about 20 years since Dawn of Dreams, and as unbelievable as it is to see a new Onimusha game, this is probably the most potential that Onimusha will have, making an impact on its franchise. Capcom isn't spiraling into bankruptcy like they were when the franchise first started. They've hopefully learned from their mistakes of altering their product too much to appeal to Westerners. They have a lot more experience with how to make an action game, and we also don't have to worry about having a horrible English dub with voice actors who perform like they hate their job. So basically, if Capcom is somehow able to mess this up, we riot.
Will discover me again? So brand new, 100%